And today, we are doing a deep dive into a book that will genuinely flip the script on how you see the world around you, the infrastructure, the science, even the data that runs your life.
We're talking about Caroline Criado Perez's incredible, and I mean meticulously researched work, Invisible Women, exposing the gender data gap.
This book feels so necessary, which is why we wanted to cover it. It lays out this huge and frankly pretty alarming argument.
It really is. The argument is that for millennia, half of the human population has just been systematically left out of the data pool. You know, the data that's used to design pretty much everything.
Everything, like your phone's voice recognition, medical diagnoses,
urban planning, emergency response, you name it. It's all based on this foundational data set that just assumes the default human is male.
So the book really just documents the consequences of this. What does she call it? An absent presence.
Yeah, an absent presence. And the effects, as we're about to see, they range from just annoying things all the way to things that are absolutely lethal.
Okay, let's unpack that core concept right away.
Yeah.
The gender data gap. It's an easy phrase to say, but what does it actually mean structurally?
Well, structurally, it's the result of what Criado Perez calls this universal human habit. When we think of humanity, we default to man.
It's not just about statistics then.
No, it's deeper. It's a conceptual flaw. The male experience, his body, his work patterns, his travel habits, all of that is treated as the universal, the gender-neutral standard.
Well, the female experience is seen as, what, like a niche deviation?
Exactly. It's the other. As Simone de Beauvoir put it decades ago, he is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other.
And what's so crucial here, and the book really hammers this home, is that this isn't usually about explicit malice. It's not some evil plot.
That's right. It's not a conspiracy of chauvinists. Criado Perez calls it a form of not thinking. It's just the failure to remember to ask the question, hey, how does this affect women?
Or even just, is this data set actually representative of everyone?
Right, because that male default is so ingrained in science and politics, not including women in research. It's not seen as a flaw in the methodology. It's just seen as normal, standard practice.
So let's get into the consequences, because that's what makes this so urgent. We're not just talking about minor annoyances. Let's start with something subtle, but something a lot of people will recognize. Why are offices always so cold?
Oh, this is a perfect illustration of how deep this male default runs. So many women complain about shivering in their offices, and there's a very specific reason for it.
Okay.
The standard formula used to set office temperatures, it was developed back in the 1960s, and that formula is based on the metabolic resting rate of the average 40-year-old 154-pound man.
From the 60s.
From the 60s. And it was just never updated to account for, the generally lower metabolic rate of women or different body composition, or even the fact that women tend to wear lighter clothing in professional settings.
So the office is literally engineered for a male metabolism. And I think I read a recent study confirm this.
It did. That old formula, when you test it against female physiology, it overestimates the female metabolic rate by up to 35%.
Wow.
So when that thermostat hits, say, 72 degrees, it's calibrated to make a man feel comfortable, but it leaves a lot of women feeling actively chilly.
And this extends to physical design too, right? Like shelves in a grocery store.
Yeah, think about how high top shelves are, or cabinets in a kitchen. They're often designed for male height and reach norms, which makes them inefficient or just inaccessible for a huge chunk of the population.
Okay, so those are inconveniences, big ones, but still inconveniences. Let's escalate this to where the data gap becomes genuinely lethal. Let's talk about engineering and medicine.
This is where it gets terrifying. Let's take car safety. Women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash than men.
47%.
And 17% more likely to die. And this isn't because women are worse drivers, it's because the safety measures have been designed and crash tested using dummies modeled after the average male body, typically 5'9", 170 pounds.
So can you explain the mechanics of that? Why does that male default dummy fail women so badly?
Well, the anatomical differences are huge. Women on average are shorter, they're lighter, they have lower bone density. But a key thing is their neck musculature is different. Okay. And they sit differently in the seat, often further forward to reach the pedals. So when a crash happens, that combination makes women way more susceptible to whiplash and leg injuries. The forces the car is designed to handle are just wrong for the female body.
Even when they did introduce female dummies, weren't they just smaller male dummies?
For a long time, yes. They were often just scaled-down versions of the male dummy, which completely failed to account for things like pelvic differences or how the spine aligns.
And that exact same structural failure happens in medicine. A big one is heart attacks.
Absolutely. Heart disease is the #1 killer of women, but they are far more likely to be misdiagnosed right after a heart attack.
Why is that?
Because the classic symptoms we all know, that crushing chest pain, pain in the left arm, those are male default symptoms. Women often present with nausea, jaw pain, fatigue, shortness of breath.
Things you might not immediately think of as a heart attack.
Exactly. So the entire medical literature, which was heavily weighted with male subjects, defined these female-specific symptoms as atypical, and the result is lethal, delayed diagnosis, delayed treatment, and higher mortality.
So if these gaps exist in physical design, in medicine things we think of as objective, how is this getting amplified in our world of big data and AI?
This is a real urgency now. Algorithms are only as good as the data you train them on. It's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. So if we feed these new technologies our historically corrupted, male-biased data sets, data that leaves out women's medical histories, or their work patterns, or how they move through a city, we're just automating and amplifying those old biases at a scale we've never seen before.
Like an AI tool that penalizes a CV for having a gap for maternity leave.
Or a diagnostic tool that fails to recognize female heart attack symptoms. It's baking the bias right into the future.
Okay, so as we go through all this, you've identified 3 themes that just keep coming up again and again. 3 areas where this not thinking is most obvious.
Yeah, these are sort of the 3 narrative threads throughout the book, and they're the areas that are ignored because they either affect women exclusively or just affect men a lot less.
What are they?
First is the female body itself, like we just saw with cars and medicine. Second is the huge, invisible structure of women's unpaid care burden. All the domestic work, the child care, elder care, the stuff that makes society run but isn't paid for.
And the third?
And third is male violence against women. The unique, pervasive safety risks women have to navigate every single day, which are so often dismissed or just not even measured by policymakers.
Okay, let's trace this bias back to its roots. The historical, the cultural context of this male default. Where does this even start?
Well, it has deep, deep academic roots, especially in anthropology. You can point to this huge symposium back in 1966, famously titled Man the Hunter.
Man the Hunter.
Yeah. And the consensus that came out of that was that successful hunting, which was assumed to be a male activity, was the evolutionary engine that drove everything. Social cooperation, tool use, our intellect, our emotions, everything.
So that theory basically just sidelines half the population in our own evolution.
It does. It created a weird theoretical problem. If men were driving evolution, what were the women doing? Were they even fully participating? Then in 1975, an anthropologist named Sally Slocum comes along and challenges this with Woman the Gatherer.
A counter theory?
A counter theory. She just asked the simple question: what were the women doing while the men were supposedly out hunting? They were gathering, managing infant dependency, doing all this critical care work.
And what did she argue was the true source of our adaptations?
She argued that things like cooperation, communication, tool development, they likely came more from the necessities of gathering and care. That required complex knowledge, long-term planning, shared responsibility, maybe more so than the short bursts of activity associated with hunting.
So the man the hunter bias wasn't based on overwhelming evidence.
No, it was an interpretation of pretty scanty data, all filtered through this really ingrained assumption that male activities are the ones that matter.
And we see this mirrored in our language, right? The whole generic masculine, using man for the whole species.
And this isn't just about being politically correct, it actually alters how we think. Study after study confirms that when you use the generic masculine, people are more likely to think of famous men, to estimate professions as being more male-dominated.
It mentally erases women.
It does, and the bias is so strong it can even override existing stereotypes, which is incredible.
What do you mean?
There was research showing that when you use the generic masculine, even jobs that are stereotypically female-like beautician or secretary people in the study suddenly pictured them as being predominantly male.
Wow.
That's how powerful that linguistic default is. It's strong enough to just overwrite reality in our minds.
This pattern, where the assumption of male just trumps objective evidence, is so perfectly illustrated by that story of the Viking warrior skeleton.
The Burka warrior, yes.
Yeah.
A 10th century grave in Sweden. It's the perfect, most striking example of this assumption blindness. For 100 years, that skeleton was assumed to be male.
Why?
Because the grave was filled with the gear of a high-ranking warrior, a sword, an axe, a shield, arrows, 2 sacrificed horses. In the archaeological mind, warrior equals male, period.
But the bones themselves told a different story.
They did. Multiple archaeologists noted that the pelvis was apparently female, but this evidence was just dismissed, explained away. Any historical text about female fighters was written off as, mythical embellishment. The male assumption was just too strong.
Until DNA testing.
Until DNA testing in 2017 confirmed beyond any doubt that the bones belonged to a woman. And only then was the academic world forced to change its mind.
And even then, there was resistance.
Intense resistance. Scholars immediately started questioning it. Oh, maybe the bones were mixed up. Or maybe she was just buried with the warrior's gear for symbolic reasons. Not because she was the warrior.
Which would never happen with a male skeleton.
Never. No one ever questions it when a male skeleton is found in a grave like that.
Yeah.
It just shows how that default setting male, unless proven otherwise, works to exclude women from history and from power.
And this cultural omission, it's reinforced constantly today in media representation.
Oh, the data is just stark. Look at children's media. A big international study found only 13% of non-human characters, like animals or aliens, are female.
13%.
And in G-rated films, only 28% of speaking roles go to women. It's so total that even in crowd scenes, women only make up 17% of the people in the background.
So even in the background, women are statistically marginalized. How does that loop back to the design failures we were talking about?
It creates the self-fulfilling prophecy. When media and history constantly show the male experience as the norm, the universal standard, it just reinforces that not thinking among policymakers and designers.
Right.
A course on white male writers is just literature, but a course on female writers is immediately seen as specialized, as other. This data gap is both a consequence of that mindset and a driver that keeps it going.
Okay, so we got the foundation. Now let's move into our first deep dive. Daily life, the tangible bias you can see and feel in design and urban planning. And this starts with a kind of surprisingly insightful example, sexist snow clearing.
Yes, the case of Karlskoga, Sweden in 2011. It's perfect because it reveals all these hidden assumptions about how people move. The city was doing a gender equality review, and an official joked that surely snow clearing would be safe.
He was wrong.
He was very wrong. The traditional method was to clear major traffic arteries and big roads first, which seems logical if you assume most people commute by car.
Which aligns with a male travel pattern. But why is that bad for women?
Because travel patterns are fundamentally gendered. Men dominate car access. Women are disproportionately reliant on walking and public transport. But more importantly, women do something called trip chaining.
Trip chaining?
Yeah. A typical male commute is A to B, home to work to home. A typical female journey is A to B to C to D. Drop kids at school, go to work, run an errand, get groceries, then go home.
All these complex trips that rely on walkways and bus stops being clear.
Exactly. So by prioritizing roads, the city was prioritizing the male commute while making the female commute, often done while pushing a stroller or carrying bags, much harder and more dangerous.
So they were basically forcing women to wade through uncleared snow.
Right. So when Karlskoga realized this and shifted priorities, clearing walkways, bike paths, and bus stops first, the benefits were immediate. They calculated a drastic reduction in the economic cost of women's fall-related injuries, which had been hitting their healthcare system.
So it's not just about fairness, it's actually more efficient.
It's about efficiency and economic benefit.
And we see this same not thinking about mobility and housing design.
Oh, yeah. The book points to the disastrous results of this Brazilian public housing program, Minha Casa, Minha Vida, My House, My Life.
What happened there?
They built these massive complexes on cheap land, far from jobs and transport. The planners just focused on building the structures without asking who would live there and where they'd need to go.
And the data on who needs that mobility is clear.
It is. In a city like Rio, 71% of cars are owned by men. So women who rely on public transit were suddenly facing commutes of up to 6 hours a day.
6 hours.
It essentially stranded them. It forced many to abandon formal jobs and resort to illegal home-based work, all because the planners just completely ignored the reality of women's economic and care lives.
And in contrast, you have places like Vienna, which are actively doing gender-sensitive urban planning.
Vienna is the gold standard. When they planned one housing complex, the Autofrier Mustersiedlung, they actively fought these biases. They got rid of the high ratio of parking spaces, which are often dictated by male default laws, and put that money into social infrastructure.
Like what?
Communal laundries, more play areas, green spaces for all ages. They even designed apartments with the kitchen in the center to make childcare more visible and challenge the idea that housework is this solitary female task. It was all built from data about how residents actually live.
Now, let's turn to maybe the simplest piece of infrastructure that reveals this gap, the public toilet. You call this the Barbican gender neutral with urinals mistake.
This is such a perfect encapsulation of the male default human design. So in some places, like the Barbican in London, they tried to create gender-neutral bathrooms.
Okay.
But what often happens is they take the old men's room, which has urinals and cubicles, and just relabel it gender-neutral. And they take the women's room, which is all cubicles, and also label it gender-neutral.
But the math on that doesn't work out for women.
Not at all. Urinals dramatically increase male capacity. They can handle more people per square foot. Women need cubicles, and on average, they take longer. So when you make the cubicle-only space gender neutral, you're now asking all women to share a space that was designed for the small fraction of men who needed a cubicle.
While the men still get the massive efficiency of the urinals.
Exactly. So the queue for women gets even worse, all because the design was based on a universal need that actually just favors the male function.
And this problem of sanitation goes beyond just inconvenience. It becomes a really serious feminist issue in other parts of the world.
Absolutely. The lack of safe, well-lit, lockable public toilets is a major contributor to violence against women. In many developing countries, women will literally hold it all day, avoid drinking water to minimize trips.
Which has to have serious health consequences.
It does. Dehydration, heat illness, chronic UTIs, even toxic shock syndrome. And when they do have to go, they often wait for dawn or dusk, which exposes them to harassment and sexual assault. One study in India found that women who had to use open fields were twice as likely to face sexual violence.
This issue of safety and harassment is also rampant on public transit, but it's hugely underreported. It's its own data gap.
It's a silent epidemic. The stats are patchy because men often don't see it and women don't report it because they fear shame or disbelief. The book cites these startling numbers. Up to 90% of people who experience unwanted sexual behavior on London transport don't report it.
90%.
And in the NYC subway, it's as high as 96%. And that silence becomes its own data gap. Policymakers can say, well, the problem doesn't exist, we don't have the numbers, while ignoring all the structural reasons women are forced into silence.
Let's finish this section with youth planning. How did traditional, so-called gender-neutral park planning end up excluding girls?
Traditional planning just created these big, open, concrete spaces, for youth activities, team sports, skating, graffiti. What happened was these spaces quickly became dominated by large groups of boys.
And girls just dropped out.
They dropped out dramatically after about age 10, whether it was social conditioning, safety concerns, or just not feeling confident competing for that space.
So what was the evidence-based solution in places like Vienna and Melma?
The solution was simple. Subdivision. In Vienna, they just broke down the big parks into smaller, defined zones. This immediately reversed the female drop-off. It made the spaces feel safer, more manageable. In Malmö, they actually asked girls what they wanted.
And the economic justification is there, too.
It's strong. In Gothenburg, they found they were spending 15 million kroner more on boys' sports. They calculated that if they invested more in girls' sports, they could reduce future fractures from osteoporosis, 3/4 of which are suffered by women, costing the city 110 million kroner a year. Investing in equality literally pays for itself.
We've seen how the male default shapes our physical world. Now let's shift to one of the book's huge themes, the economic invisibility of women's labor. This is chapter 12 context, this idea of women as a costless resource to exploit.
Right. And to set the stage for this, you have to remember the 1975 Icelandic women's strike. 90% of women in Iceland walked out for one day. It was called the Long Friday.
And the entire country just stopped.
It ground to a halt. Offices closed, schools shut down, supermarkets ran out of things like sausages. It proved that the term working woman is basically redundant.
There's only a woman who is not paid for her work.
Exactly. And the data on this unpaid work imbalance is one of the most stubborn gender gaps in the world. Globally, women do 75% of the unpaid work. That's 3 to 6 hours a day, compared to maybe 30 minutes to 2 hours for men.
And that ratio is, remarkably sticky.
remarkably sticky. It doesn't change much with household wealth or education, or even if you have hired help.
So what are the consequences of that imbalance on women's paid labor and their health?
Well, when you add up paid and unpaid work, women's total work time is just drastically higher. And this overload has direct, severe health impacts. A big UK study found women had 53% higher rates of work-related stress, anxiety, and depression.
And what's really fascinating is that the breaking point, the threshold for that stress, seems to be lower for women.
Yeah, the data shows this crucial difference. Women's mental health starts to deteriorate when they're working fewer paid hours than men. For women, working just 41 to 55 hours a week significantly increased their risk of mental health problems. It's a threshold men just didn't experience.
Suggesting that the invisible workload is pushing them over the edge much sooner.
Right. The constant mental load of planning and logistics from their unpaid work.
And then motherhood comes along and just blows up the gender pay gap.
The motherhood penalty is severe. The pay gap between men and women explodes in the 12 years after a child is born. It can reach up to 33% in the UK. This is because policies just consistently fail to account for the time women take out for care.
And we see this in gender-blind policies, like the UK's pension auto-enrollment. How does that system penalize part-time women workers?
So the UK system requires you to earn at least £10,000 a year from a single employer to qualify for the pension.
A system designed for a full-time male default worker.
Exactly. But women who are trying to balance paid work with all that unpaid care are disproportionately working in multiple part-time jobs, so they fall right through the cracks. 32% of employed women earn enough in total, but because it's split across different employers, they miss the threshold.
And the U.S. tenure track system in academia presents a similar structural problem.
Absolutely. The tenure track gives you 7 intense years to make it right when you're in your prime childbearing years, 30 to 40. So married mothers with young kids are 35% less likely than married fathers to get those tenure track jobs. The system forces a collision.
Which is why interventions that actually address the care load are so successful.
Right. The book highlights a few. When Google extended its maternity leave, the number of new mothers quitting dropped by 50%.
Wow.
And a more specific example is this foundation in Germany that funds female academics by paying for domestic help. Cleaning, cooking, babysitting. It explicitly recognizes that the barrier isn't a lack of ambition. It's a severe lack of time and support.
Let's transition now to Chapter 13 context, from purse to wallet. This is where we see how our economic models are built on faulty assumptions, starting with the biggest number of all, GDP.
Gross domestic product. It's our measure of economic output, but the book argues it's, in the words of one economist, a confection. It's an arbitrary measure that just excludes crucial things.
And since 1934, it has excluded all unpaid domestic and care work. Why? How do they justify that?
Well, the rationalization was that goods produced in a household for household cleaning, cooking, childcare, they weren't essential or productive in the same way that goods made for the market were.
So early male statisticians just didn't see women's work as contributing in a necessary way.
It was the ultimate male default. They treated it as a non-essential complication, not the actual foundation that supports a healthy workforce.
But when you do try to put a value on that unpaid work, the numbers are huge.
Staggering. In Mexico, unpaid chair work is estimated to be worth 21% of GDP. That's more than manufacturing or commerce. In Australia, one study calculated unpaid childcare as the country's single largest industry.
And by excluding this, governments can treat it as this costless, infinite resource to just exploit.
Which leads directly to this vicious cycle of austerity. When governments cut public services like childcare to save money, it's actually counterproductive.
How so?
Because that burden immediately shifts onto women. They have to do more unpaid work, which means they participate less in the paid labor force, which directly reduces national productivity and, critically, reduces GDP. McKinsey estimates that without the increase in female participation since 1970, the U.S. GDP would be 25% smaller.
So any austerity that targets social care isn't saving money. It's shrinking the economy.
It's depressing the nation's economic output by sidelining half the workforce.
And a core error behind a lot of this policy is the assumption that household resources are shared equally.
Yes, the zombie assumption of equal sharing. It's lethal in policy design. A perfect example is the U.S. joint tax return system.
Right.
Nearly everyone files jointly, but the system stacks income. So the wife's income, since she's usually the secondary earner, gets placed on top of her husband's higher bracket.
So her income gets taxed at a higher marginal rate than if she filed on her own.
Precisely. The system actively penalizes the secondary earner, usually the wife, and acts as a real financial disincentive for married women to even be in the paid workforce at all.
So the real economic solution isn't just stopping cuts, it's proactively investing in social infrastructure, like early childhood education.
Absolutely. The research is clear. Investing in things like childcare and elder care is an economic boom. Studies show that spending on early childhood education has a greater positive impact on long-term growth than business subsidies.
Because it reduces women's unpaid labor load.
It reduces their unpaid load, it increases their employment rates, and it puts money back into the economy through taxes and spending. It's a clear economic inefficiency caused by a failure to invest.
Okay, let's move to Chapter 14 context. Women's rights are human rights, and the deep structural resistance to female political representation.
Right, and the evidence that female representation is a good thing is incredibly strong. Decades of studies confirm that female politicians prioritize issues like family policy, education, and care. They're just significantly more likely to sponsor those bills.
There's a metric for that, right?
Yeah, a 10% increase in female political representation has been shown to increase the probability of kids getting a primary education by 6%.
But despite that proven benefit, women who seek power face this unique ambition penalty, which was famously applied to someone like Hillary Clinton.
Her ambition was often called pathological, which is a word you'd never hear applied to her male opponents. This ties into what's called norm violation theory.
What's that?
High office is just cognitively associated with men. So when a woman seeks it, she's violating a really deep societal norm, and that leads to these strong, emotional, negative reactions.
Sounds like the warmth competence trade-off you hear about in the workplace, just blown up to a national scale.
It's exactly that. Women who show ambition are penalized by being seen as cold or uncaring. Society expects women to be warm and pro-social. When they go for competence and power instead, studies show it inspires moral outrage in people, a reaction you just don't see when men do the same thing.
And this bias leads to the myth that female politicians are only talking about identity politics.
Right, that narrative that was pushed by people like Bernie Sanders. It's not good enough to say, I'm a woman, vote for me. It reflects the assumption that the male perspective jobs, the economy is universal, and the female perspective is niche.
But the data on Clinton's speeches showed that wasn't true.
Not at all. A word frequency analysis showed she overwhelmingly talked about jobs, education, and the economy, just like the men. She was just assumed to be focused on her gender. It's the cognitive filter we view female leaders through.
So if representation is the answer, the data suggests that just hoping for it doesn't work. You need quotas.
The Swedish Social Democratic Party is a good case study. For years, non-binding recommendations to include more women did nothing. It was only when they introduced mandatory targets and then actual quotas that female representation went up.
Quotas are controversial, though.
They are, but studies show they don't promote unqualified women. They actually act as a corrective. They tend to weed out incompetent men who are only there because of old patronage networks. They force meritocracy.
And even when women do get into power, their influence is limited by being excluded from those informal networks.
Right. The real power is rarely in the formal meeting. It's on the golf course or over late night drinks, these informal spaces that are male dominated and where women are often excluded, and that just siphons away their ability to impact policy.
And the resistance actually gets worse as more women get into power. It turns into political abuse and harassment.
It's this cruel paradox. The abuse is distinctly gendered, and it's a major deterrent. 66% of female parliamentarians regularly get misogynistic remarks. Over 75% of British women in leadership programs said online abuse was a major concern for them running for office.
And research has actually quantified that as women gain power, men try harder to control the conversation.
Yeah, studies found that as the proportion of women increases, male aggression and interruptions also increase. This hostility leads to women having less success passing laws, fewer appointments to powerful committees. It's a systemic pushback.
Okay, we're shifting now to part 6. When it goes wrong. Chapter 15 context. Who will rebuild? This is about how crisis and disaster just magnify all these data gaps.
Right. When a crisis hits a war, an earthquake, the exclusion of women is rationalized as a matter of urgency. We have to focus on saving lives and rebuilding the economy.
But that's a false choice.
It's a total fallacy. What they're really doing is prioritizing the male default economic and social structure and treating the needs of women as this secondary minority issue that can wait.
And we saw this play out after the Gujarat earthquake in India in 2001.
The rebuilding projects there were planned entirely by men without talking to the local women. And the result was houses that were functionally useless for them, kitchenless homes or houses with no space for animal care.
Because they missed that cooking and animal husbandry were women's work.
They missed it entirely. So they built these inefficient homes that just increased women's work burden.
And after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, we saw a similar thing.
Absolutely. The single largest group of displaced people after Katrina were African American women, but their voices were completely ignored by the male-dominated planning boards.
The planners were focused on redevelopment.
They were focused on demolishing public housing for opportunistic redevelopment. But that housing, however flawed it was, provided this crucial social infrastructure that women relied on. Tearing it down erased their safety nets and worsened their mobility issues.
And in conflict zones, there's UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was supposed to fix this, but it's barely been implemented.
UNSCR 1325 from the year 2000 urged more participation of women in peace efforts, but implementation is minimal. Only 2 women have ever been chief negotiators for a peace accord. Ever.
And the excuse is always that including women would delay negotiations.
It's an idiotic rationale. The irony is it completely undermines the goal. Studies of 182 peace agreements found that when women are included, the probability of that peace lasting at least 2 years goes up by 20%.
Yeah, for 15 years.
It goes up by 35%. Excluding women is not just a moral failure, it is demonstrably counterproductive to peace and security.
Our final dive is into Chapter 16 context. It's not the disaster that kills you. This focuses on the disproportionate physical toll that conflict and disaster take on women.
The data here is just devastating. More than half the world's maternal deaths happen in conflict-affected states. Maternal mortality is 2.5 times higher.
And relief efforts consistently fail to provide basic female healthcare needs.
Things like birth kits, contraception, obstetrics care, they're deemed secondary to core aid. So pregnant women are left to suffer miscarriages or give birth in horrifyingly unsanitary conditions.
And this pattern of ignoring gender roles makes things like disease control fail, like with Ebola.
Women's caretaking roles put them at much higher risk. They're the majority of nurses, cleaners, and the ones who prepare bodies for funerals. During the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, 60% of those who died were women.
And the initial quarantine plans failed because they didn't account for women's work.
Right. The plans made sure households got food, but they forgot about fuel and water collection tasks done by women. So women were forced to leave their homes, which just drove the spread of the infection.
Natural disasters follow the exact same deadly trend. There's a huge mortality gap.
A huge analysis of 141 countries showed that women are considerably more likely to die in natural disasters, especially where their socioeconomic status is low.
And the 1991 Bangladesh cyclone is a tragic case study for this.
The death rates were almost 5 times higher for women, and it was largely because of male-biased infrastructure. The warnings were broadcast in male-only spaces like markets and mosques, so they missed the women at home.
And the cyclone shelters themselves were unusable for women.
They were built by men for men. Just big concrete boxes with no separate latrines, often just one bucket for 1,000 people. Because of cultural taboos, women refused to use them. They feared sexual violence and shame. They chose death over dishonor or assault.
Finally, this nightmare continues in refugee camps, where women are just constantly vulnerable.
Despite clear international guidelines for safe, segregated, lockable toilets, they're routinely ignored. A study in Lebanon found 98% of female refugees didn't have access to separate latrines.
Which forces them out at night, where they're vulnerable to assault.
Yes. And it leads many women to dehydrate themselves or even wear adult diapers to avoid those night trips. And the policy failure is masked by officials saying, well, there are no reports of sexual violence, ignoring all the reasons women don't report.
We've covered everything from crash test dummies to UN peace talks, all driven by this one fundamental omission. To wrap this up, let's look at the book's afterword and this profound anecdote about the crocheted solution.
It's a beautiful, perfect analogy for the whole book. A Latvian mathematician, Dana Taimina, solved this century-old geometry problem about modeling hyperbolic space, a really complex shape.
Right.
For decades, male mathematicians had been struggling with paper models that just didn't work. But Taimina realized she could model it perfectly using crochet. a traditional domestic feminine skill she learned as a girl.
So she brought in a perspective that had been excluded because it was seen as women's work, and the entire field benefited.
Precisely. Her story proves that when you introduce perspectives from outside the established male default norm, all of humanity benefits. The irony is that the traditional scientific method was failing to model reality accurately because it was too narrowly focused.
And this brings us back to the central irony of women's invisibility. They're both hypervisible and profoundly invisible.
They're hypervisible as targets. For interruption, for catcalling, for abuse. But they're invisible when it actually counts. When it comes to being counted in the data and the design that determines their safety and their economic security, we've naturalized the discrimination because the exclusion is just too commonplace to even notice.
So the solution is straightforward, even if it's structurally really difficult. We have to close the female representation gap.
The conclusion of Invisible Women is crystal clear. The outcome is better for everyone when women are involved in decision-making. Female biographers are more likely to write about women. Female journalists center female perspectives. Women in power don't forget that women exist.
And the knowledge to fix these problems, it's not some big secret. It's already held by the women who are living in these flawed systems.
It is. Whether it's philanthropists like Melinda Gates starting initiatives to close the data gap, or the local community leaders, usually women, who rebuilt Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria by literally wading into flooded neighborhoods to collect the data on who actually needed help. The knowledge is already there.
We just have to ask.
We have to stop prioritizing the male default over the complex, messy, but necessary reality of half the human population.
So if this deep dive has resonated with you, and we really hope it has, here's our final provocative thought for you to mull on. Given that the male default perspective has historically inflated the value of things associated with men, like salaried work, while minimizing others, like care work, what invisible work are you doing today that, if it were actually counted and valued correctly, would fundamentally change how your own productivity and worth are measured?
Something to think about as you navigate a world designed by data that may not even know you exist.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.